what is Grails anyway? Grails is part of this new trend toward complete stack frameworks. The idea being is that rather than pick some open source or whatever project for your view layer, like Velocity templates or SiteMesh or FreeMarker or any of those, and then have to pick something for your persistence layer, like Hibernate or TopLink or OpenJPA, etc., and then pick something else for your service layer like the Spring framework or Google Juice or some of the others. Instead, Grails says, look, we made all those decisions. We put everything together. It's already working. All you have to do is run some scripts, and as long as you follow our conventions, you don't have to do very much configuration at all to get a very nice application up and running very quickly. Now, if you don't want to follow the conventions, then you simply have a little bit more work setting things up to configure them the way you want them. But Grails is very flexible in how you can map to whatever you want to map to. We'll talk about that. We'll see examples of that as we go. So the complete stack goes all the way from the view through the middleware, the service layer, the DAO, the data access objects, persistence, and everything to the database and back through, based on other projects that are quite mature. The idea is that convention over configuration business. It's an open source project. You can just download and run it. Very easy to use, and one of the nice features about it, it's very easy to deploy as well. We'll just export a WAR file, drop it into Tomcat or any other J2EE server or Java EE server, and it just runs right out of the box. So the version on Grails at the moment is version 1.3. I think it's 1.3.3 came out yesterday. I immediately downloaded and found a bug, but I'm using 1.3.2 in today's presentation. How can a version 1 product be considered mature? Well, Grails is built on top of the Spring framework primarily, especially the MVC portion of it for building the web application. For the object-relational mapping, by default, it uses Hibernate, and Hibernate is quite mature. So is Spring, for that matter, the Hibernate object-relational mapping layer. Other portions that come in, that are built into Grails, like the view templates, are done through a technology called SiteMesh. They build in various Ajax libraries like Prototype, and you can always add plugins for Dojo, Scriptaculous, jQuery, whatever you happen to prefer. There's an immediate plugin for Quartz scheduling. There's a nice plugin for searchability with Compass or Lucene. There's a lot of nice projects. So basically, anything you can do with Spring, you can either do immediately with Grails, or there's a plugin to add it in. Most things are right there. Some things are added later. Similarly, any database that you could map with Hibernate, you can use with Grails. And there's a nice custom ORM tool as well to make that easier. If it turns out we have time, I'll try to show an example of the custom ORM mapping as well. But let's try to build something first. Now, of course, Grails is built on top of Groovy. And where does Groovy fit in? Well, I mentioned before that the vast majority of the Grails code base is in fact Java. The reason for that is that we're building on top of Spring and Hibernate and several other projects, and those are written in Java. There's no need to port those to any other language. It's quite comfortable using them as they are. And most of the industry these days is using Spring in one form or another, maybe not the MVC layer, but certainly the core part of Spring with the dependency injection and the lifecycle management and everything. But so it's been built inside of Grails. Hibernate is also probably the most common object-relational mapping tool, a tool to convert object classes into database tables and back again. Grails is there. Groovy basically provides the glue, if you will, to connect all these pieces together. Plus, Groovy as a dynamic language is a great language for writing what they call domain-specific languages, DSLs. These are little languages with a few keywords and a few operations that allow you to do interesting things with a minimum of code. We're going to see an example of that with Gorm, the Grails object-relational mapping framework. But Groovy can be used to make all sorts of little languages like this, and they can be very, very helpful in some cases. So we'll see how that ties in also. If you're not familiar with Groovy in general, Groovy is a programming language. It's a separate language. But it's interesting in that it's very similar to Java, and in fact it compiles to Java bytecodes. So in other words, whatever you compile in Groovy can run on the JVM. And I can use Groovy code to contact Java classes and vice versa. I can use Java code to instantiate Groovy classes and invoke methods on them as well. As a matter of fact, almost every Groovy class actually uses some Java in it because they didn't reinvent the API. You still have the whole Java libraries. Groovy adds additional libraries as well, but it rests on the bedrock of Java. It also brings these modern language features, things that Java doesn't have yet, like optional typing or builders or closures. We'll talk about a little bit of that as we go. But the fact of the matter is, while you do need to know something about Groovy to be productive in Grails, you don't have to be an expert at it. And by knowing Java, you actually know a lot about Groovy, and you can add on as you go. You don't have to do everything right away. Okay, how do we install Grails? Grails, in fact, is an open source project located at grails.org. There's the download link. It does assume that you have Java installed, a JVM installed on your machine. So you set the Java home variable so Grails can find it. Download Grails. It just comes as a zip file. There was a Windows installer. These days I haven't bothered with it. Groovy has a decent Windows installer, but Grails, basically you just download a zip file, you unzip it, and you set a Grails home variable to point to it, add the bin directory to your path, and you're ready to go. Most people, now you can use Grails from the command line. That happens a lot. But if you prefer to use an IDE, as most developers do, an integrated development environment, there are several whose Groovy and Grails support are, let's say, coming along. The support is not fantastic, but it's a lot better than it used to be. Now, Grails comes with the shell command that's a command line client and a console that is basically the same Groovy console, just with all the Grails domain classes added into it in the class path. But if you do want to use an IDE, most people like Eclipse. That's still even if they're not wild about it, that's still the most common IDE in the industry. Eclipse has a Groovy plugin, and it handles Grails, but it doesn't really know Grails. The Grails plugin is really over at Spring, and Spring makes available a product called Spring Source Tool Suite, and I'll show you that a little bit later. I'm going to use that to illustrate different aspects of a Grails project. It's a very nice system, and it has a Grails plugin that works with a Grails project very easily. Now, a lot of the core team members use the IntelliJ IDE. That one has worked with Groovy and Grails for a while, although the pace of innovation on that seems to have slowed down somewhat, but it's still around. Also, every version of NetBeans from 6.5 on actually has a Grails project type built into it. I've used that fairly often. Version 6.9 just came out a week ago or so. I'm going to use that today to show you some aspects. So in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use both NetBeans and Spring Source Tool Suite to illustrate aspects of Grails projects. That said, you can still do everything from the command prompt in any IDE that, well, even Notepad if you wanted, but preferably any IDE that did your syntax highlighting and code completion for Groovy code, and Java as well. All right, how do you start a Grails application? Well, there's a command. Now, most of these commands, remember, we put the Grails framework in the path. So in this case, you call the create app command on Grails, and you just give it a name, whatever your application name is going to be. And this is where Grails convention over configuration kicks in. It builds a standard directory structure with special directories for domain classes and controllers and views and everything. You CD down into that directory, the my app directory, whatever your name of your application is, and from there you have a range of commands like create domain class, create controller, create view, generate all kinds of things that we're going to look at. And these commands will generate classes in the proper directories as well as test cases that you can use. Now, test cases are empty, but at least they're there and they're ready to go. And I hope to show you a little bit of that as well. Grails is one of those frameworks that prefers domain-driven development. In other words, in every Grails project, it's probably best to start off with your classes that are going to be your model. So you wind up building, you do your object-oriented decomposition of your class structure, and then that can map to databases, and that can work with the views and everything. Ruby on Rails, as by contrast, really works with your database. Everything is generated directly from the database structure, and you go from there. Grails prefers to work with the classes instead, and if you have an existing database, they provide a custom mapping mechanism to let you connect those two together. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about the dynamic scaffolding, and then I want to start building an application. So first of all, just to get you started, once you build your domain model, 1 class, 2 classes, however many you want, you can then generate controllers for those classes, and in the controllers you simply say, okay, I want the scaffold to be whatever the name of the class is. This def over here, def keyword, is short for define. It's a Groovy keyword, meaning I don't have a data type in mind. I don't really care what it is. So anything. You know, it's like a var data type in JavaScript or anything else. By doing this, then I'm going to be able to see everything out of the box, and once my domain model settles down, I'll be able to go to the static scaffolding. So let me first start off here with, let's see, this is NetBeans IDE version 6.9. I am going to try to make the fonts as big as I can, but I can't magnify other parts of this. Let me start off by saying I'm going to make a new project, and it will be a Grails application. And of course, if I'm going to search for something on Grails here, I might as well make it, oh, sorry about that, the Holy Grail. I suppose I should say Holy Grails, but after all, there's only one Grail, right? At least hopefully. Let me make sure when I configure Grails, then I get a pop-up to say, where is my Grails home variable? And I'm using version 1.3.2. That's fine, so I'll say finish. The project is currently, or the IDE rather, is currently building the normal project structure. And if you look at it in this view, under the project view, you see that they have sorted everything into domain classes, controllers, message bundles, services, etc. But I want to go to the files view here for a moment and show you this is basically what things look like on your drive, on your hard drive. So here is my project, which I called Holy Grail. Whoop. While it's scanning, it sometimes likes to close things up, actually, but I can show you that on the disk as well. There is a directory called Grails app. It's got child directories for controllers and domain objects and for services. Also, there's, oh, and for views as well. For views, it has a layout, etc. So I don't have much to start here. I think I want to add a domain class. So let's see. Let's add a new Grails domain class, which I will call Quest. And I will put in the com.skillbuilders package. Package structure used just like Java packages here. It's fun working with IDEs, isn't it? They tend to slow everything down. At any rate, here is my package. This is a Groovy class. You see the lack of public and private here. Classes are soon to be public. You don't need semicolons. This is my Quest. It has no properties yet, so let me add in Quest at the minimum ought to at least have a name. So let me say I'm going to have a name on my Quest, and I think it would be nice also to have a start date as well. Now, I could actually just stop at that, put in a little bit here. Maybe I will start with that. So let me just save that. And now I want to generate a controller. Let's see. A new controller, which I will call, let's see, based on Quest here. And again, it's in that same com.skillbuilders package. And here's my controller. It simply has an index action at the moment. Let me change that to scaffold equals Quest and save. Believe it or not, I now have enough to have a fully operational application. So let me demonstrate that. Now I could run this inside of the IDE. There's a run method that will go ahead and run the main project, and it would all work just fine. The thing is, though, I tend to be very reluctant to do that. I much prefer to run from the command line because, you know, if for some reason the project were to fail, or the IDE rather were to fail, then it's a question. It may not shut down the server. I may need to go find the server, etc. So let's see, NetBeans projects, and then this is called Holy Grail, and here is my project with the Grails app directory and lib and scripts and everything. And now I'll just say Grails run app. And we have 3 modes. We have a development mode, a testing mode, and a production mode. In the development mode, everything's going to be refreshed on every request. So it's a slower process, but this way everything will be available whenever we want to see it. And if I want to make any modification, I'll be able to see it. So there, it's compiling everything. There, server's running. Now, Grails comes with an embedded version of Tomcat. It used to have Jetty. Then recently they've switched to Tomcat for that. Let's see here. No, that's not the one I want. That's the one I want. So let's see. We want to go to localhost 8080/Quest, Holy Grail, right? Holy Grail. And there you go. So the application is now currently running. In the default layout here, which of course you can replace, they give you some information about the version numbers. There's the Grails version, the Groovy version, the JVM. There's one controller, one domain class. Tag libraries are built in. Various plugins, including Tomcat. So that's what's running right now. Hibernate is being used as the ORM, and there are various others as well. Here's my controller. So if I click on it, there we have a list that shows all the quests, and right now there aren't any. There's an ID that was added automatically and a name and a start date. If I say new quest here, then I get a form to fill that in. I'm going to seek the Grail. The start date, since I called it a date, I got this date little widget here with a drop-down list. I'll just take what I have and call create. And now you can see the quest was created. There's the start date. There's the ID that was auto-generated. It's working from a database that is built into Grails that's an in-memory HSQL database, in case you're curious. One of the things I'll do later is I'll switch to an external MySQL database so you can see them all. Now if I go back to the list here, you can see now I've got the list. I have a hyperlink built into the ID. That brings me to the show view. If I want to edit it, it brings me back to this view. If I make a modification, Grails, and then I click Update, that works as well. Let me make that edit back to what it was. And I can also delete it, and it'll give me a little pop-up to say, are you sure? And I'll say cancel just to go to the list. So you see, that's the dynamic scaffolding in action. All I did was create a single domain class and then create a controller and say, hey, controller, I want to use dynamic scaffolding, and it generated this complete set of information here. Now, one of the things I don't like at the moment in this default situation is if I say I want to make a new quest and I don't put in a name and I click create, I get a quest without a name, and that doesn't seem like an appropriate thing to have. So let me go back into my quest here, and now I can use this constraints section, and I want to say that for the name, I want the constraint that it cannot be blank, it can't be empty. As I save that, what you'll see is that the server will detect a change in the domain class, and it will probably update. And when it does, then I'll go back to my browser here. Oh, it hasn't updated yet. Server running. That figures. All right, let me restart it. Sometimes it picks up the changes without a problem. It's actually supposed to work pretty interactively, and it does and it doesn't. It does pretty well with controllers and services and everything. It's when you modify the domain class, that affects the database mapping, and sometimes that takes a little bit of time to fix. Also, I've got a bunch of stuff running on my machine here. So let's see. There. Now I go back here, and you'll notice right away I've lost my existing one. This is because, as I mentioned, right now we're using HSQL in memory. So I'm going to have to do something about that a little bit later. But now if I click on New Quest and I try to say Create, I come back with an error message saying property name of class com.skillbuilders.quest cannot be blank. That's the default error message for violating a blank constraint. Now that's pretty good that I already got that, but I can do better. Let me go and look at, let's see, message bundles. Here's my message properties file, and these are all the defaults that would be set for, say, internationalization, the I-18N business. But I can reuse this file for my own error messages. Now the thing is, I need to know what this key is for this error message, and this is where you go to the Grails framework reference documentation. The reference documentation is really very, very good, and they work very hard to keep it up to date on every version. So here I have all these command line usage links and constraints, and on constraints, if I click on blank, it says to validate that a string value is not blank. They show you how to use it, and they say error code is classname.propertyname.blank. So if I go back here to my properties file, and my class name was com.skillbuilders.quest. My property name was name.blank, and I'll say quest must have a name, and I'll save. Whoop, sorry, hit the wrong button. Okay, it's saved. I saw something refresh here, and now if I go back to my application and I just try again, if I create again, it changed it to quest must have a name. So it's easy enough to modify, to add a constraint and to modify the values of the messages as well. If you were to take a look at the messages back here, you'll see that they have parameter substitution in property 0 of class 1 with value 2 cannot equal 3. So you can work with all of those as well, and it'll automatically substitute in the properties as you want. Okay, now before I go on, let me cover a little bit about relationships, associations. So there was my dynamic scaffolding. What about static scaffolding? Well, I'm going to hold off on static scaffolding until my domain model settles down, and I want to add a few more classes before that happens. But this would, instead of just having auto-generated controllers and views, this would actually generate the code showing you all of that. Because right now, I don't have a Quest controller or Quest views at all. Everything's being generated on the fly. If I go to generate all, then I'll see everything and I can go edit it. I'll show you that shortly. And then you saw this is how I ran the application. Just Grails space run-app, and there it was running on Tomcat on port 8080. There's flags to set if you want to change the port number, etc. Okay, Grails comes with this HSQL database using an in-memory version by default. If I want to see this, I look inside the, let's see, configuration. Here is my data source.groovy. You can see that it's a pooled data source using the HSQLDB driver. They've got Hibernate properties, including a second-level cache already built in. And then I have these three environments: development, test, and production. And in development, my data source uses this create drop method. And this is what this means is that whenever I restart the application, I drop the existing tables and regenerate them. The update would not drop anything. It would add additional columns. It won't delete any data or any columns. And then, of course, for your production one, this one you'd normally either leave this update, or if the whole idea of modifying the database through the app like this gives your DBA palpitations, then you can simply remove the DB create property entirely, and you'll have to have an existing database. Now, in mine, I'm providing usernames and passwords in the file because I'm working locally, but there is a mechanism to work with a JNDI lookup, JNDI data source. No problem to do that as well. Again, we're just in the beginnings of building this application, so I'm not trying to get into great detail yet. Okay. So essentially, zero configuration. Can add to bootstrap.groovy for startup. That's true. There's a way you can initialize the data. Tables dropped on every restart. We can switch to a real database. I'm going to show you one with MySQL. There's the data source.groovy information. If I do want to use a different database, then there's a lib directory. Again, convention over configuration. You drop your database driver into the lib directory. You modify data source.groovy to use the right driver class name and the right URL, and you're just all set. And there's the business about the db create property. Now a little bit about Gorm. Gorm is a Groovy domain-specific language built on top of Hibernate. So it basically is generating Hibernate configuration information. It doesn't generate a Hibernate config file. One of the reasons that the core team members of Grails chose Hibernate is because Hibernate allows you to generate configuration programmatically. They have a configuration class, and it works with that. The nice part is how it supports all these different relationships, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, etc., and custom mappings for existing databases. So we'll also talk about the optimistic locking. Let me actually build in this thing already. Let me start working with that right away. So I currently have a quest. What I now want is a quest is not much good if it doesn't have tasks in it. So actually, can I right-click on the package? New domain class. Yes, it filled in the package. A quest has tasks associated with it. Finish. And as well, I ought to generate, this is the thing I forget half the time, is don't forget to generate the controller as well if I want to use the scaffolding here. For the task controller, again, I'll just say scaffold equals task. Oh, I have a running server, don't I? I really don't like to work on this thing while the server is still running. So let me shut this down at the moment. There we go. Now I can save my task controller. And for my task, I'm thinking that, first of all, tasks make sense to have a name as well. And by the way, I'm not using def in here. I'm using actual data types because these data types are going to be mapped to the database. The database does actually want data types. Int priority for the task, and then let's put in a start date and an end date, like that. And how about a Boolean to see whether it's completed? And of course, that'll be initialized to false. So here is my task. Now what I want to do, I could just leave that alone, but what I want to do is go back to my quest, and here's where we get a little bit of the Gorm mapping. I'll say static on my quest. I'll say static has many equals tasks of type task. This is the Groovy mapping type of construct. So on the left-hand side, I'm adding an attribute called tasks to my system. The data type will be my task class. And by saying has many, I've created a one-to-many relationship in the database tables on this. So let's see. Let's also put in my start date here. And now on my task, here's what I can do. I can either put in something like this, just say quest, queue, or whatever, and I'll be able to navigate from the task to the quest that way. But in fact, tasks belong to a quest. If you don't have the quest, there's not much point in having the tasks either. So I'm going to actually enforce a belongs to relationship on this, where I'm going to say that the tasks belong to a quest of type quest. This will enforce a cascade delete. This basically says if the quest goes away, so do the tasks. And that ought to be enough. Let me restart the server here. And then I'll show you what happens with all of that. There is SQL being generated. There's a config file that allows me to log the SQL in case I want to look at it. I haven't turned it on at the moment, but that's easy enough to do. It can get fairly verbose, but it generates the same SQL that Hibernate would generate. And of course, that's a good thing to be watching, frankly. Okay, so there's that. Let's go to the browser here. Oh, that's not that one. I want that one. So let me go back to the home here. And now I have two controllers. Let's start with the quest controller. So again, I've lost my data. I'll have to do something about that shortly. So we want to seek the Grail. And there's my quest. And if I click on the Edit button, it says, oh, you want to add a task? So I'll say, sure. So now, the order of these things came out a little funny, right? If you look at it, they came out alphabetical. I don't really want them alphabetical, but let me at least show that this works before I try to fix that. When I'll put in a task here, which will be run away from the killer rabbit, which has a priority of, say, 3. And this in the drop-down list would show all the available quests, and this is their default two-string method, the name of the class and then a colon and then the ID. And there's the start date and the end date, or actually that's the end date, the start date. If I click on Create, now I have a task, and it's connected to a quest. If I make another task, let me make just one more before I go on. Let's see, this will be Answer the Bridge Keeper. That one, that's a high priority. Same quest. If I click on Create here, now you can see that also is linked to the quest, and when I click on the quest, I can see it has 2 separate tasks. So that's not too bad. Getting fairly interesting. Let me go and fix some of the things I was talking about before. So let me shut down the server. And let me go to the IDE here. And first of all, I'm getting tired of typing those things in. So let's go into the bootstrap.groovy. There's my init method. And say I want to make a new quest whose name is Seek the Grail. And on that, I want to go .add to tasks. It knows that it synthesizes the method add to tasks because I told the quest that it had a has many relationship with tasks. So add to tasks takes as an argument a new task, which I can either instantiate directly, which would be like run away from killer rabbit, and then priority, which was I think 3 or something. And then of course I want to save this. And what it's upset about right now is that I need to put in an import statement. SkillBuilders.star. And now I can see all of that. And now I've made my quest and added a task to it. And frankly, as long as I'm adding a task, why don't I add a second one? Name will be Answer the Bridge Keeper. I'll give that a priority of 5. And then I can just hit save and they'll be in there. Now one thing I want to do over here on this task is I put in a name and a priority. Let's put in, make sure that the start date and the end date currently are null. So I want to say let's at least initialize them so that when I create a new task, it'll automatically start on the date I created it, and the end date, let's make a new date +1. Again, this is Groovy that has overridden the plus operator to let you add a day onto a date here. Also, let me add a couple of constraints, and then we'll run this thing as well. Again, now the form you saw had all the properties in alphabetical order. I can actually go in whatever order I want, and by listing the constraints down here, or listing the properties in the constraints block. So I'll say name can't be blank, and the priority is in a range from 1 to 5. So I'll limit the priority so that they have to start in there somewhere. What else do I want to say in here? How about then I'll show the start date before the end date, and then the completed, like that. Now these are actually all method calls. This is shorthand for name, where the argument is blank, false, but the parentheses are optional. So let's see. If I leave that one like that, and I think everything is good now. Now let me start up my application again, and we should have all the data in there, unless I did something wrong. I haven't worked on the tests, unfortunately, but that looks pretty good. After I get this running, then I'm going to let Dan talk to you a moment about SkillBuilders, and then we will jump ahead, because I want to show you, in the interest of time, I have an application much further along than this, and I don't want to take the time to generate it all right now. So let's see. If I go back to the home here, and I go to the quest controller. Oops, looks like I made an error. What did I do? Where's my quest? My bootstrap. I did put in a name. All right, well, this is the basic process, but rather than try to work out the details right now, let Dan talk to you a moment about SkillBuilders, and then we'll switch over to one and I can illustrate things in one that I've already constructed. Okay, Dan, did you want to comment for a minute there?
Please, thank you, Ken. Some very interesting stuff. I just wanted to take a few seconds to let everybody know that SkillBuilders offers classes in both Grails and Groovy. So if you like what you see and you want to learn more, just head to our website at skillbuilders.com to take a look at our class offerings. On screen now is the 28-hour Getting Started with Groovy and Grails. Another class you may find of interest is Groovy for Java Developers. Classes are offered both online and on-site. Online classes will have both two-way audio and screen sharing enabled, so you can ask questions and get assistance when needed. And of course, your presenter today will be your instructor for the class. That's all for now. I'm going to hand things back over to Ken for the remainder of the presentation.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, here's just for your information, the Getting Started with Groovy and Grails basically is a Grails class where we start off and give you one day of a Groovy overview in order to bring you up to speed on enough Groovy to be able to make progress. The other class is dedicated to Groovy, and at the very end it says, oh, by the way, there's something called Grails, and we run through a Grails application. So they're intended to be complementary to each other. Okay, now where was my command prompt here? Let me shut down the server, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to Spring Source Tool Suite. And this is an application that I've written already called Quest, logically enough. And what I want to do is walk you through a little bit of information there, and then when we have code to give away, I can give you the full application here. So let me at least show some of the pieces of this. So first of all, here's my Quest class, and it looks pretty much the same. Let me bump up the font size one more size just to make it a little bit bigger on this. So I want the text font to be let me make it 16 point. Hopefully that will be nice and readable. And you let me know. There, that should be easier to follow, I hope. So, at any rate, there's my quest with the name and a start date. Oh, that must have been, I must have forgotten to initialize the start date on the other one. That's probably what I forgot. And therefore, it was null, and I didn't say it couldn't be null. And if you don't say it can't be null, then the table that's generated will have a not null constraint on it. So no doubt that's what happened. So here I'm making sure the date has a value. There's my has many with the tasks. But I also say a quest has many nights as well. So here's the night class. A night has a title and a name. Let me get this out of the way. A title and a name, and a quest that it's associated with. I didn't make that a cascade delete relationship. I don't want to say if I delete the quest I lose all the nights. That doesn't seem fair. But it does belong to a castle. So nights are associated with the castles, and I'm assuming if the castle's gone, the knight's probably going to go with it. I could go either way on that. Here's my constraints. The title has to be in the list of Sir, King, Lord, or Squire. The name can't be blank, but castle and quest can be nullable until I supply them later. You know, I don't have to know them right off the bat. Also, this is an override of the toString method, the normal toString method in Java, so that I'm outputting a big Groovy string here saying put in the title and the name, and then append onto that, is there a castle? Then put on of castle, castle, else put on an empty string. Something like that. Now what's a castle? A castle has a name and a city, and here's the interesting part, latitude and longitude doubles. Castles have many nights. What I want to do is I want to be able to map these on a Google map. So I put in some constraints here also. The name and the city come first. I could put in latitude and longitude, but in fact I want those to be auto-generated. So after I've generated the code, I'd like to strip those out And again, there's my toString method. So there's the castle with the name of the city. I don't say country because I'm hardwiring it to the UK, seeing as how the quest for the Holy Grail in this application is going through the United Kingdom, basically. So that's, oh, did I do anything else with tasks? I put in a little bit more with the constraints. The name can't be blank. The priority range is still there. Start date. With the end date, I put in a custom validator that basically this says that the end date has to be later or equal to the start date. That's all. And so I could check all of those different things. One other piece is a service. This is called a geocoder service. Now, a service is where your business logic goes, and if you're familiar with the Spring framework, this becomes a Spring bean that is injected into other classes on demand. So I'm basically saying this is using Google's geocoder. Google has an open source, or not, I don't think it's open source, but a free geocoder that you can access merely by typing in a URL. And when you type in the URL, you can append values to it and wind up with results that show you where the latitude and longitude are. If I go to that, let's see, Google Map Geocoder, I think it's API, that ought to be enough. Version 2, I wanted version 3, let's see. Yeah, geocoding, version 3 of the map. Whoops, that's not right. I'll just show you what it looks like without worrying about the details here. Basically what you do, oh, that's what I want, it's geocoding service documentation. Here we go. That's right. So here, where's the API? All you do is you send a request to the following URL, ask for either JSON or XML output back, fill in these parameters, some of which are optional, and you get data back, like here's the XML form of the data that comes back. So let me keep that in mind. When I go to my geocoder that I wrote, the geocoder service, I'm going to use this thing called an XML slurper that's from Groovy that reads XML files. So here I've got a collection of parameters. This sensor one, you have to specify whether you're making the call from a GPS-enabled device. Of course, the desktop is not. If I was doing this from a handheld, it would be. So that's false. And then my address is going to be the castle city, and I'm saying it's in the UK. I'll URL encode those, join them together, and then turn them into a key equals value string separated by an ampersand. The result of all this Groovy code will be to write out a URL with key equals value and key equals value and everything nicely encoded just the way you want. By calling the parse method on that URL, I automatically go to that URL. And the return will be an XML document that looks like this. So I want to parse that, and then all I have to do to find the values I want is walk my way down the tree. So result.geometry.location.lat is, you see here, there's the response, result, and then there's a geometry, location, and there's lat, and there's LNG, the latitude and longitude. I take both of those, I assign them to the castle, and I print them out just for grid so you'll be able to see what they were. And now where do I use this thing? Well, I already generated my controller. Rather than just using the dynamic scaffolding, here's the static scaffolding, and if I look at my castle controller, then right here, by just declaring the geocoder service, by using the lowercase g but the rest of the way the class is defined, the service is automatically instantiated and plugged in at that point. That's Spring dependency injection. And now to use it, down here in the save method, basically what I say is okay, make a new castle off the input parameters, and if the latitude or the longitude are 0, then go ahead and call fill in lat long on that castle instance and then try to save it. So most of this code was already here. I just said fill it in. And in order to use this, well, first of all, let me show you the thing running. Okay. So here's another DOS prompt to say, okay, Grails run app. Actually, I want to do there. Grails run app. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. And then I'll finish up on some of the other slides. I know we're running fairly short on time. So I just want to illustrate this for you, give you some idea about what else is possible take a couple of questions if there's time, and then we'll call it a day here. So let's see. Now, the basic functionality you saw there was simply to run the server. Or to build the application, I've added a plugin that allows me to use a Google Map. So now let's see. I want to go to Quest. The plugin I'm using that does Google Maps brought in this font image controller. I don't need that. But if I go to my Quest controller, you can see there's my Quest built in. And if I look on the Quest, you can see then I've got my various tasks, with various capabilities. And if I go back to the home and I say, well, let's see, what knights do I have? I don't have any knights in there yet, but I do have a castle. I, in fact, have 2 castles, because I put them in my Bootstrap code. And what I did here, let me show you the Bootstrap code real quick. Whoops. There we go. The Bootstrap code is here. And it says, okay, do a find by name, and if I don't find the quest, then create one, and there's the add to task, add to task, add to task. Also, I'll do a castle find by name. If I don't find this castle, then instantiate a castle, call the fill, again, I declared the service up here, so it got injected, call fill in lat long and save it. Same thing with the second castle. So here are my two castles, and each of them wound up generating a dot on the Google map, and you can see there's my info and everything. And all of this was just using a very simple plugin. Let's make a new castle here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So let's see, I need another castle. From the movie, I guess there was Castle R, and I don't know where it is. So let's put it in, let's see, Edinburgh, right? I might spell that wrong. I need something I can spell. Let's see. Liverpool. I mean to take out the, these are editable now, but I don't want them to be editable. I mean to just turn those into fields. But whatever, if I click Create, notice how it already added in the latitude and longitude. So if I go back to my castle list now, there's my new castle up here, Castle Arg. And you can see that in the list, there they are. There's my additional one. And I can edit them and do whatever I like on that. So there you go. There's the basics of a Grails application and how easy it is to build these things. These things, by the way, are sortable columns. I can sort the cities so that I got Liverpool there, or I could sort them by, or they're already sorted by names. But if I click on it again, it should reverse sort by name. It's regenerating the page, so it's not just an AJAX call. There are many good ways to do AJAX as well. Let me finish up with some of these things. Gorm does optimistic locking by default. If I look at the database at this point, I would be able to see, let's see, where is my database here? Let's close this down and go into MySQL. I think I put in -u Grails, and I want to look on, let's see, what did I call it? Quest. Show tables. I'm not seeing them right at the moment. That's all right. They're there, believe me. So at any rate, what Gorm will do is it insert a version property to help you do optimistic locking. You can customize the eager and lazy fetching just like Hibernate. It automatically inserted the ID property for us. We can tell it not to do that if we don't want. There was the validation stuff, blank, enlist, email, or credit card. Those come from the Apache Commons validator, which are basically just regular expression validators. Range, unique, etc. Build your own. It's using Spring, and you can use the properties file for the error messages. I showed you that. These are the dynamic finders. These are generated automatically based on domain class properties. So they all look like find all or find by, and here's the form of find by property and then a suffix and then a Boolean. In other words, here's an example. Book.findByTitle, Groovy in action. Or book.findByTitle like, and you put in a like clause, a %sign. find by release date between start and end, or find by title like and release date greater than whatever. So that all of these are auto-generated for you. You don't have to write any of the code. You just have to define the properties, and Grails takes care of the rest. It generates all these methods and adds them as static methods on the domain class, so the domain class kind of becomes its own DAO layer through the static methods. You can use Hibernate criteria queries as well, or even HQL, Hibernate SQL if you prefer to. The controllers had all those different actions in them. They write to the output stream or redirect to another controller or action or go to a view, or they did what I was showing and actually just return a value, return the model to a view. And services, again, that's for the business logic. There's Spring Beans. They can use declarative transactions if you want. All you have to do is declare the reference, and they're injected wherever needed. Groovy Server Pages look like GSPs. I didn't show you one of those. Let me show you very quickly the one with the Google map in it. Here is the list GSP. And I've included a custom tag library, but you see it looks like HTML just with some tags with some G's in front of them. Sortable columns, and let's see what else. Field values to pull values out of the beans, and paginate buttons. I happen to add the map itself based on some markers. There are other tag libraries available. It's very easy to make a custom tag library too, surprisingly enough. Very simple. There are hundreds and hundreds of plugins. A couple hundred listed there, but there may be even more than that. If I click on this, I think I'll go to it. There's a whole list of plugins here, and for example, one which if we had more time I'd show you is the searchable plugin. It's a trivial example. Is that the one that's moved? No, it's still fine. Go to my quick start. And all you do is you say Grails install plugin searchable, go into your domain class and say static searchable equals true, and you're finished. It even comes with a sample form. You just go to localhost your app name /searchable, and it'll give you a little form to search these post domains for any objects that you might want. I mean, this is typical of the plugins. They're very easy to use, and there's tons of them available. Spring Security is a big one. I've used that several times. Well, not as much as Apache Shiro. It used to be called JSecurity. Searchable I mentioned. There's CAPTCHAs and reCAPTCHAs for when people have to read a little image to verify that they're a human. The email plugin is very nice. You just configure it to where your SMTP server is, and you've got a simple little mechanism for sending off emails. Quartz scheduling, again, you can create tasks that will run on a periodic basis or one time or whatever you like using cron syntax. There's a feeds plugin to generate RSS or Atom feeds. There's charting ones, testing ones. The only problem with these is that they're all relatively immature, so they do tend to change, and then you've got to figure out a way to update, or even if you want to. The deployment story is very simple. You just type Grails war, and that's it. You wind up with a war file. You drop it into Tomcat or WebSphere or what have you, and it just works. It includes all the Spring and Hibernate jar files in it, so these war files get to be fairly sizable, 10, 20 megs actually. But on the other hand, they're complete. You don't have to add anything or configure anything. You do have to configure your database tables, of course, if you're going to do a Jindy lookup. But other than that, you're ready to go on this. A little bit about testing. They generate a Grails unit test for every domain class very easily, and you can use that to test all of your classes. And again, if we had more time, I'd show you that, but there's some built into the app. Here's just a little snippet about that custom ORM mapping business. Here he says, if I had a class called person with a string name, I meant to say first name and last name, but here's the bottom line. If person mapped to a table called people, I just make a mapping closure. Say table people, and first name, the column is first underscore name, and now it'll work directly with that existing database table. Or if you're generating the table, it'll generate a table called people and a column called first name. So it's easy to work with existing tables. It's easy to map to new tables. You do have to write out your mapping closure, but it's a very simple syntax, very clean, easy to write. Okay, where do you get all this stuff? I mentioned Grails.org. The link's in there for the reference guide, which I showed you. There are very active and helpful mailing lists, especially for the user list, the developer list as well, and there's one specifically for the Eclipse plugin. But the user list for Grails is really helpful. I have asked questions there a few times, and I've never gone more than a couple hours without getting good answers back. Very friendly to newcomers as well. Most of the core Groovy and Grails team members are on Twitter. They also follow the mailing lists, etc. Here's a couple of books. The definitive book is the Definitive Guide to Grails. Graham Roche is the head of the Grails project. Jeff Brown is a core team member. The second edition just came out middle of last year, maybe later than that. Dave Klein has a very nice beginner book called Grails, a Quick Start Guide that'll get you up and running very quickly. Scott Davis revised an earlier book by Jason Rudolph called Getting Started with Grails. This is at InfoQ. If you just go to the link, you can download that for free. You have to register, but then you can just download it as a PDF, or you can buy it for $22, but it's easy enough just to download it. And then there's Glenn Smith and Peter Ledbrook. Peter Ledbrook's another guy who's in the core team. Glenn Smith runs something called the Grails Podcast. They wrote the Manning book, Grails in Action. Again, all of these are good, all very helpful. And I think that's as much as I put in there. So let's
Ken,
go ahead.
We actually do have a few questions in the queue.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll take 3 today. The first question is regarding optimistic locking.
Yes.
What level of locking within the database occurs? Table, row, or other?
It's none of the above, actually. What they do is they put in a version column, and every time that a transaction is completed on that row, the version number is incremented by 1. So if you've checked out a row and you're trying to make changes and somebody else is working on the same row and they commit, then what happens in the controller is it checks to see that your version number is different from theirs, at which point it redirects you to the display and says, sorry, you've got to refresh before you can use it. So it doesn't actually lock the row at all. It just makes usage of the version column number.
All right, thank you. The next question is, how would you determine the level of maturity for a given plugin? Are they certified by the Grails team?
No, they're actually pretty open, but they do put version numbers on these things, and my experience is people are pretty honest about it. Also, you can always go into the user list and ask somebody if anybody's used this one and what their experience is. Most of the ones that are put out by core team members or that are on mature products, like Quartz scheduling or things like that, tend to be very solid. The version numbers tend to be very low, though. You'd have to take a look at that.
Okay. And last question, in case of a WAR deployment, how would you externalize the configuration file settings, such as log4j settings?
They have a config plugin. There's a plugin that will let you actually get access to the config files themselves, and then you can modify the application any way you want. There is log4j built into it, and there's a config file where you can put that in there, but if you want to pull your values from outside, I think there's a way to do that through a Spring plugin. I mean, through getting the Spring properties and reading them from a properties file there.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Folks, we do have a few more questions in the queue, unfortunately. We've run out of time for today. I'd like to thank everyone for taking an hour to attend the webinar with us today. Don't forget to check out our Groovy and Grails related classes, which you can find on our website at SkillBuilders.com. Also, keep an eye out for future webinars surrounding these topics, as I'm sure Ken has plenty to come. Thanks again.
And if you have,
oh, sorry.
Just saying, if you have questions that you really need an answer to, I'll do my best to answer it if you send them to my email address. We're going to put all this stuff up on SkillBuilders, but right now you can see my email address on the screen if you'd like to grab it. So, sorry, go ahead.
Nope. I just want to say thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.